Yips.
Well, good afternoon. Welcome. My name is and I'm an adjunct here at the Faculty of Political Science and a member of the Board of the Institute of International Affairs. And the Institute is very happy to welcome Maria Strömling from Lund University in Sweden. Maria is an assistant professor in political science and deputy director of Lund's University Center for European Studies. She's here as an Erasmus scholar for almost 2 months. And she is going to talk to us today about whether bureaucracies kill creativity and experience of the European Council. And I'll just give you the floor. You have up to half an hour, let's say, and then we'll have time for discussion. Please.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here to talk about this because for me, the opportunity of going to Iceland, first of all, was a fantastic opportunity. It was made possible in part because Alison Bales, who is here in the Department of Political Science, agreed to make an exchange with me. So she has been in Lund previously this semester, and I now have the opportunity to spend the second half of the semester here. And while I'm doing that, I'm here to do a little bit of teaching, but I'm also here to think about new research projects. And what I'm going to talk about today is, in a sense, a little bit some thoughts that came out of a previous research project that I did a few years ago together with a colleague in Stockholm. But it's also at the same time, I hope, the start of a new coming research project. So that's why I am very happy to have this opportunity to try and talk about it here and see what the reactions might be. And the question is, of course, posed a little bit pointedly to say, do bureaucracies kill creativity? But I'm asking that question because it's actually something that was claimed, in a sense, by a French president in the 1970s. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing said something to the effect that if we're going to have new and creative ideas about international politics, we cannot have too much bureaucracies involved because they will kill the new thinking. And so that's why I'm posing the question like this. I am, of course, not going to come up with an exact yes or no question to this, but I am going to suggest here today that we might want to think a little bit about if we want to have political institutions that can provide new, forward-looking, visionary ideas for the future to global problems, that maybe we would think about to what extent we actually want to also formalize, institutionalize, or bureaucratize those institutions. So I think that's my overall aim today. And I wanted to use the experience of the European Council for a specific reason. And that is that the European Council, as I am assuming that all of you know, is the overall, if you wish, political institution in the European Union put in place in order to provide political guidance, political visions, political direction to the whole European integration project. And it's consisting of, as you can see on the photo, 28 heads of state or government. Each state decides, each member state of the EU decides if they want to have a president or a prime minister. But it is the highest political figures in each country in the 28 member states, plus the commission of the president of the European Commission and a permanent president of the European Council. So it's 30 people all in all. And this whole idea of having the prime ministers and presidents meet on an institutionalized basis, on a regular basis, is not that old if you look at world history. Before 1970s, there were, I would claim, no institutionalized regular summits, meetings between only presidents and prime ministers. There were meetings, for sure, on a lot of different occasions, but in an institutionalized sense, saying that we should have our prime ministers and presidents meet on a regular basis is fairly new, and it's an idea that started to materialize in the 1970s. And I think that going back to that point and see why the summit format, the format of the heads of state and government was institutionalized, is saying something about the thinking behind what you should do if you want to have a forum for new creative thinking, for new visions, new political ideas. And that's why I wanted to start today by going back to the 1970s and see what was discussed when the European Council was created. And it turns out, when you go back to the history books, 1970s, early 1970s, you find that there were two discussions going on at the same time. There was, of course, the world situation in general requiring a lot of new thinking. It was the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, it was the Vietnam War, it was, of course, the Cold War going on. And a number of other dramatic world events, the October War in 1973. There were several things happening at the same time that required world leaders from a number of the big countries discuss how can we move on with this, how can we find new ideas, how can we provide better solutions to global problems. And these discussions led up, on the one hand, to the creation of the G5, which then became the G7 and now, and a while ago the G8 and now back to the G7, but you know what I mean. And it also, at the same time, led up to the creation of the European Council. One being, of course, made up of countries not only in Europe, G5 was broader than that, but the European Council then being the summit format for the European Union member states. And they were both created in 74, 75, so around the same time. And if you look back and look at the motivations behind this and the discussions which took place between the West Europeans and the Americans most of all, on why and how you should create a summit format, you will see that there was something of a European view. It was mostly pronounced, I think, by Giscard but also by Helmut Schmidt. And they both kept claiming, when they talked to Washington, that what we need, both for what was to become the G5 and the European Council, is that we need a very private, very informal meeting of those who really matter in the world. Because what we need is not another decision-making forum. We have those. What we need is somewhere to get away, as Giscard said, away from the petty bureaucratic structures, and instead find a way first to discuss and deliberate on what should be done, and then we can just send it down to the regular forums. Then we allow for the diplomats and the bureaucrats to go and execute. But we are the ones who are needed to come with these new solutions. They tried to tell the Americans this, but they got a very clear reply from Washington. Washington said this: we can't possibly fly the president across the Atlantic Ocean for a seminar. The Americans said that if you are going to have discussions, it needs to be prepared on beforehand. We need to have very fixed, clear diplomatic processes, bureaucratic processes, so that once the president comes to the meeting, we already know what's going to be decided. So it was a very different view. They said we need this type of efficient preparations, long preparations, so that there's no surprises, nothing unclear when the president comes. He's supposed to come, sign, go off again. That's the efficient version. So those two views clashed a little bit. And when you look at how the G5 was set up, and how the European Council was set up, you will see that G5 was set up according to the American view. And the European Council then became set up in the European sense. So if you look at the European Council, the first formal one was actually held in 1975. The decision was taken in 74. And this is from the press conference afterwards, and not from the actual informal meeting. You will see that there was no bureaucratic involvement at all. They decided very openly that there's going to be no bureaucrats. They're not allowed in the process, not on beforehand and not in the meeting. They said, we're not going to have a formal agenda. We're going to come here and discuss without knowing on beforehand what it's going to be. Most of the time, there would be an informal agenda put up by the presidency, say the night before. Some diplomats testified to. They came to the hotel in the evening before the meeting, or the persons who came with the prime ministers, and they would get sort of slid under the door a little note saying this is going to be some of the discussion points tomorrow. But that was it. It wasn't prepared more on beforehand than that. They were going to have no formal rules of procedure. The presidency would just tell them where to sit. The presidency would say, let's sit here around the conference table for an hour, then we go have a coffee for an hour. And it was just up to the presidency how they wanted to organize the meetings. There was no rules about how to do it. It was agreed that they would never take any formal decisions. They would just provide, if they had any ideas, guidelines, and then send it down to the normal union decision-making processes, to the Commission, to the Council, to the Parliament, and so on, to go and execute what they decided to do. So there were no decisions here. Those were political guidelines, forward-looking guidelines. They were going to have no formal conclusions even. They just had the presidency write up. This is our minutes from the Council meeting. this is not a formal, no one actually formally agreed, they didn't take a formal decision that this is our conclusions, although of course they all vetted in a sense the conclusions, but it was formally put out as the presidency's conclusions and not as the European Council's conclusions. So they didn't even have a formal, even legal sense output from the meetings. And they decided very clearly that when the prime ministers and presidents went to meet, they were only allowed to bring one personal representative each. No delegations were going to come with them to the meetings. They were just going to have the one person. They could pick whoever they wanted to bring. Should they want to have, say, state secretary or another minister or something, but one person, full stop. They became known as Sherpas, and because they carried the briefcases to the summit with the prime ministers. But that was it. So the meeting formed very small, completely informal, and that's what they tried to stick to from the beginning. Now, since I only have half an hour here, maximum, I'm going to jump from this situation and up to today's situation. This is a very fascinating story how we ended up with today's situation. But by doing it like this, jumping 40 years in time, on the other hand, I will show how much has happened over 40 years. Today, when the European Council meets, it is a completely different story, of course. There has been a dramatic and very, very clear, over the years, formalization of the decision-making obligations. Nowadays, we expect the European Council to take a lot of formal decisions. There's a lot of formal decisions already said in the treaties that the European Council should take. It's already specified. Plus, the fact that they tend to increasingly, and have increasingly over the years, had to make decisions on issues that the normal council formations cannot take. When they can't agree in the Agricultural Council or the ECOFIN or wherever, they will send it up to the European Council to decide. So that's also becoming, in a sense, decision-making obligations. They are becoming like the last resort where they will have to adjudicate when the sectoral councils can't agree what to do. So they've had, they have to do, every time they meet, they have to take a number of very formal decisions. There has also been a very, very clear formalization of the preparatory processes ahead of the meeting. If you compare to just getting a note slid under your hotel door in the evening before the meeting to know what you're going to talk about the next day, these days there are a lot of rules on how and when you are going to start clearing the agenda. So already now, I would say that we know already a little bit, in terms of topics at least, what's going to go on even in the spring European Council, say 6 months from now or even 7 or 8 months from now. About 8 weeks ahead, there's already a more detailed agenda starting to become circulated between the member states. And 4 weeks ahead, the agenda is fairly finalized in terms of the topics and the headings. We end up with 1 week ahead of the meeting. The General Affairs Council needs to meet and formalize pretty much everything. And after that, it's considered that most of the things are already settled. If there is some outstanding issues, they are of course left to discussion or debate, but normally those are very, very few. So normally almost everything is already agreed, say at least 5 days ahead of the actual meeting. And on top of this, and maybe most fascinating, there has been a formalization of the meeting procedures. Now when they come, there's no talk about coffee and, well, of course they drink coffee, but there's no talk about the fireside chats and the whole idea of a relaxed environment, an informal environment anymore. That's completely gone. There's been an extreme formalization of the whole meeting format. It's like a very, very directed theater going on. Jean-Claude Juncker once said it's more like a ballet, but I think it's very, very strictly organized what can be done from the second that the Prime Ministers arrive to Brussels. And there's extremely strict, even the seating arrangements. You can see in this picture, how they sit is very, very regulated. There's regulated how long you can speak on every single occasions or every single agenda point. You even have to have TV screens to see who is actually speaking. There's a regulated speaking order. You really have to speak in the exact order that it says on paper, contrary to sitting and having coffee and speaking person to person. Here it is very, very strictly regulated. There are rules for when and how the interpreters are allowed in the room. They don't really show here, so there's a lot of people. They're sitting, of course, all around here now, in the back, sort of around the whole room. There's regulations for note takers, when and how they are allowed in the room, and when they're allowed to go in and out of the room. There are rules for when and how the accompanying ministers and civil servants may or may not meet. There are rules for when they may meet in adjacent rooms, when they might actually go into this room, and so on. There are rules for how many they can be. Now every Prime Minister can bring at least 20 people with him or her, plus technical staff and other things. So now we're talking about a really, really big service. There's regulations for the duration of the meetings. When the European Council met in the 1970s or 80s, sometimes the meetings would go on for several days. It was assumed, it's always been assumed, that they will meet on a Thursday and a Friday. But it used to go on much longer than that. It used to go on, if they couldn't agree, they would continue into the Saturday, sometimes even into the Sunday, and I don't know if there were examples of even longer meetings. But they would keep going on. Now there are rules saying they cannot go on. It doesn't matter if they're not in agreement or not. On Friday evening, you're done. That's it. So you're normally going to end the meeting full stop and not keep dragging on. So even that is regulated now, how long you can actually meet and talk. There's also regulations even if and when and how you can meet other heads of state or government. If you want to have third-party meetings, where if you want to have, I mean, obviously you have on a fairly regular basis meetings with, say, the President of the United States, all kinds of third parties who might want to come and meet the European Union. There's even regulations for how that can be done, when it can be done in connection with the European Council meetings and so on. So it's totally controlled by a number of rules. There's really not a lot of informality left anymore. And now why am I spending so much saying this? Well, because a few years ago, me and a colleague did talk to, within the research project that we were carrying out, we had the opportunity to interview a number of heads of state and government and ask them about how they felt about the situation, what's going on inside the European Council. Once the doors are closed, those things that we as researchers can normally not see. How do they feel about it? What was going on inside? And we didn't really ask the type of questions I'm asking today, but from their answers to similar questions, I think these are the trends that at least we saw coming out of their replies. And they kind of went a little bit against what you would think. Because if you're a political scientist and you're dealing with international institutions, if you do research on international institutions, you would say this trend in general is probably quite good. That's what most researchers would say, because for very, very specific reasons. If you want to have some kind of efficient decision making, especially internationally, but maybe also even in local political institutions, and definitely national ones, you'd say that you need to have the process to be as efficient as possible. Meaning, if you are going to reorganize it and make it more clear-cut when you start discussing things, how you discuss it, where you discuss it, how you circulate it, then you might, in the best world, actually speed up the decision making. You might increase the capacity to actually identify commonly acceptable policy options. You might also have the capacity, or increase the capacity, to handle several complex issues in a large group, because you can early on identify possible trade-offs and things like that. This is typical, at least, claims from the people who do research on international institutions, and to some extent, I'd say they could be reformulated in very common sense ideas. And I think they have been true. If you look at the European Council, I think the European Council has become quicker in many ways in terms of decision making. I think it has been better at identifying commonly acceptable policy options. I also think it has increased the capacity to handle a lot of different questions at the same time. So I think that's true. I think this formalization, if you wish, bureaucratization, if you wish, has led to an efficiency in terms of this. But this is not at all the efficiency that it was put there to do in the first place. It wasn't asked to be able to decide on 25 issues having to do with how to allocate milk quotas within the agricultural policy. That wasn't really the idea to begin with. The idea was for them to be efficiently coming up with the new visionary ideas, with new thinking. And they have become so much more efficient in the everyday, regular decision-making process. But they have not necessarily, I suspect, become so much more efficient in terms of actually coming up with new ideas. And I think if we separate these two, we end up with some kind of interesting and provocative thinking about what we mean when we say that we want to make institutions, political institutions, more efficient. And if you look at what they said, and that's what I'm going to end this with, I'm going to give you a number of quotes. I'm going to try and illustrate what actually I think happened when it came to this other idea, the idea of actually being able to, between themselves, come up with new creative thinking. And I think it didn't work so well. That's, I think, my main point. Because if you look at what they said, let me give you a few quotes. I'd say some of them, although they don't really put it in this terms, would say that there has been, over the years, fewer visionary discussions. The number of visionary discussions have decreased. Former Danish Prime Minister Poul Nyrup Rasmussen said like this: before, you could talk, you could drink coffee, you could speak twice, you could even talk of 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Today, it's 5 minutes, no more, no less. Meaning you have more time. If you want to actually say why you want something or convince the others of the benefits of some new idea, you have no possibility to do it anymore. Because now the speaking time is so regulated. Others, and we promised anonymity to some of them, that's why I don't give names of all of them. But those are quotes that we had we still have on tape, so it's they are real, even if I don't give names of all the prime ministers. Another one said there's fewer personal exchanges of opinion. You don't really talk so much person to person anymore about opinions, what could be done, because there's no time left to do that. Because as one prime minister said, with these days we just go there and confirm what we apparently have decided on beforehand. So he says we go out, we can't say that. We go out, we have lots of journalists outside waiting. Normally there's like 2,000 journalists in Brussels every time the European Council meets. So they go up to the journalists and say, we give the impression to the outside world that we are really debating the issue. But in fact there are no debates, they are confirmed. So they say, we go out and say, oh, we talked about this, and they would also of course choose, this is what they said themselves, we would always choose the big issues and say we talked about them, even if they were already agreed on. Because it sounds very strange to come out to the media for 2 days and say, yeah, we had already beforehand agreed on all kinds of things having to do with sanctions against Russia, but then we have to spend all the time again talking about milk quotas. Actually, I think the German chancellors once went out and said that. I don't know if you have the German people here. I think after the extraordinary summit in Athens in 2003, he went out and said they were going to talk about the Iraq war, and he came out and said we spend the time talking about milk quotas instead. So they keep, I think it's something that they try not always to say, because it sounds ridiculous to have them meet and spend the time on the milk quotas. They also say that the more formalized the meeting in itself gets, the more visible director you get of the big countries. So a foreign minister from a smaller country said that very often in the negotiations, if you can't get anywhere, it's the big ones who get upset or impatient, and they just leave. And he said that often there's 2 empty seats, and you see the German chancellor and Chirac have disappeared for half an hour, and when they come back, they just say, well, this is going to be the solution. Meaning you don't really have the deliberation in the room anymore, you have the big ones being impatient, going out, coming in, and telling the others, now we propose this is how it should be. We had another prime minister who said that this means also that you get fewer creative ideas discussed around the table. Because if you're a small country, particularly, he said, you don't dare to raise these ideas. If you sit there and actually get an idea in the middle of the conversation, he said, you can't really take it up if you already spent your speaking time. Because then you're seen to disrupt. Because then it's going to take longer before we get to the next agenda point and so on. So he said, you can't really do that. If you have to be, you have to make sure that you are part of the team. If you don't like to be shouted at by Mr. Chirac and the others, who will say, well, you're not cooperative. So then all of a sudden you can keep quiet, he said. If you are in this formalized meeting format, you cannot stop raising new things. Everyone will get upset with you. And as he said, especially the big ones. So the number of ideas you can get up around the table, he said, well, you just stop mentioning them if you would have any ideas. I'm not always sure that they have as many ideas as we would like to think, but that's another question. several of them pointed out, this also means in the end that we have, over the years, we've had less and less of a feeling of familiarity when we meet. They say when we were 6 or 9, we kind of had the feeling that we were a group that had a common responsibility, that we had to do something collectively. We had the responsibility, sort of the idea of the responsible statesman. It is up to us that we have to do this. Now they say sometimes we come that we don't even know who the other people are, and again you have to watch them on the TV screen when they speak, so you don't even get that personal relations. And he says, actually several of them pointed out, it's kind of embarrassing, because also, if you're in there and you don't know who a person is, someone was newly elected in Latvia and you're the president of France, you don't really know what that person looks like. And it's embarrassing to start asking, because of course you should know, because these are your peers in the group. So also don't really find out. So instead of actually going up there and trying and say, hi, how are you? Are you really the new Prime Minister of Latvia? And if that's wrong, that's really embarrassing. So rather they don't talk at all. So they said you get even less of a feeling of sort of a common destiny, of a sense of ownership of the process. And Tarja Halonen, the former Finnish president, said that it's very hard to get any kind of intimate atmosphere at all these days. Precisely for this reason. You have no forum for that anymore to get to know each other. And one civil servant pointed out that this means also that for the prime ministers, when they go there these days, they know most of the things have been decided on, and he said that the feeling has been that they even feel slightly irrelevant these days. They sit on the plane sometimes and say, do we really have to go here? We already know what we're going to decide. There's no real use anymore. And I'm not so sure if that's true for all prime ministers and presidents, but he said that some of them actually comment on it and say that it feels like we don't really have a lot of business doing here. We go here for the show, because it's raising attention, because media is writing about it, but not because we have some added value. And Jean-Claude Juncker, who when we interviewed him was of course the Prime Minister of Luxembourg and not the President of the Commission, he also talked a lot about this, and he said all this institutionalization or bureaucratization has led to the fact that the old member states have actually had some more visionary ideas from the beginning of what could be done with the European integration project in the future. They lost momentum and reduced their level of ambitions. So now he says the newer member states, he said, they had no ambitions in the first place, and the old one has lowered there. So there's no one anymore providing the new, so much of new ideas, new creative thinking into the process. And I think this is like just a proposal to say that these are things that they talked about. I don't know how you would prove it if you wanted to go about scientifically, to say that this is actually the situation. There has to be fewer ideas coming out of the system in the last 2 years than 20 years or 30 years ago. I'm not even sure how to do it. I still hope that I will have a good idea to do it. I'm still trying on figuring out a way to, if not measuring it, so at least showing some kind of trends. But I wanted to end this then with just saying that, of course, the obvious questions, when pointing this out, that bureaucratization on the one hand seems to have led to some kind of loss of sense of identity or sense of ownership, sense of statesmanship, sense of ambition with the European integration project. But the question that you always, of course, think, first of all, is that if this process has changed, if all the substantial discussions now are taking place in the bureaucratic channels long before they reach the actual European Council meetings, why don't you just raise, if you have new creative ideas, why don't you just raise them earlier on in the process instead? And some of them talked about that also, now taking a quote from from a newspaper actually, rather than a quote from the Prime Minister. But they said that one of the problems is of course leaking immediately. In a system with 28 member states, once you start circulating things, depending on what it is, you might not want to do it because it's going to leak. And Tommy wrote in the Finnish newspaper during, I think, the last Finnish presidency, that all EU documents dealing with the Middle East are also known in Tel Aviv within an hour of having been distributed to the EU member states. And it's probably also true for Washington and Moscow. And that's saying that if you have new ideas, you want to discuss something new, first of all in the EU group, you can't really start circulating it in this big bureaucratic system, because it's going to get out there. And Washington is going to, most of the time, start meddling. They're going to immediately give phone calls to, I don't know, I'm not so sure about Berlin, but maybe at least Prague or somewhere. They're going to start sort of interfering in the process. and say, once you get to the meeting, you need to stop this. And so suddenly Washington has become a part of the negotiating process. And so that, I think, is one of the problems of having this deep, long preparatory process if you want to discuss new things. Again, for discussing milk quotas, it's just good that you start discussing it early. It's probably no problem at all. But for new ideas that might be sensitive, you have no time to discuss it collectively before you have everyone else in the, also involved in the process. The other one is, of course, but my students always ask me this, why don't they just discuss, to go back to the informal fireside chat idea, having a cognac around the table. And I asked this to a number of the people we talked to, including Felipe Gonzalez. And he said, already in the 80s, we tried that, he said. We tried to move back. We tried to. He said the informator he had a European, he was the president of the European Council at the time. He held a European Council meeting in informator, and he said, we tried that. Let's not have an agenda. Let's not really prepare. Let's just discuss the big, broad things that we should think about ahead. And he said it became chaos for two reasons. First of all, because the prime ministers were kind of scared to commit themselves. They were not used to this anymore. They were used to everything being so prepared. So when they didn't have all these speaking notes on beforehand, they didn't really know how to react themselves. So they kind of got a little bit upset with each other. But he said also, there's a second problem. And that is that even if we would have succeeded to discuss some things in that format, we couldn't go out anymore to the press and say, we don't have any conclusions. We've just been discussing things. He said, in these days it doesn't work anymore. Why would you? Because again, it was obviously not acceptable anymore to say we went to Formentor for a seminar. You had to go there to come up with some firm conclusions. And so he said, we sat in there and we just realized we cannot go out, we cannot leave the room until we can tell the media that we've actually come to some conclusions. It's not enough to say that we're discussing the future and so on. So I think it's also not so easy to think that we should go back to the fireside chats. And I have no real idea what to do. But I'm going to end this now, for now, and just say that in a sense, the only big, if I have any conclusions here, is kind of a disheartening one. I was looking at photos yesterday from the European Council meetings, and I saw this photo. And I must say that I think it's fairly telling of what I'm trying to say. If you're going to go, this seems to be Schultz. This is obviously not a member of the European Council, but the President of the European Parliament. But if you have to go to a meeting with speaking points that are as fat as a book, I would say it's not going to be the most creative type of meeting. And that's what I think is my main conclusion. If that's what you need for the meeting, you can't really assume that you're going to get a lot of new ideas. It's already clear what's going to happen. That's my end. I'm sorry, I think it's maybe more than...
You were exactly, okay, 31 minutes. Well, thank you, Maria. This is really, well, a very interesting talk about a topic I didn't know anything about, so, you know, it's very curious. I think maybe a couple of things I found very interesting. I mean, obviously, you mentioned the size issue, going from 6 to 9, and this, like,